Hello everyone, I'm Mujtaba and welcome to my channel. ChatGPT and AI are undoubtedly among the hot topics these days. Using AI, you can do whatever you want. You can change your voice, create content, summarize your text, and have a 24/7 assistant. Almost every single application is AI powered, and if it's not, it's considered outdated. A few months ago, I was grading the lab reports of my students, and I noticed that some of the answers were very well written and professionally discussed. This level of quality was unusual for first year students. I couldn't tell if the answers were provided by a chatbot or not. This made me worry that the quality of education and assessments might be negatively affected by these tools. So I asked faculty members in various departments to share their points of view about AI, its effect on education, and how students can benefit from it without violating academic integrity. Please stay tuned and watch these exciting interviews. So would you walk us through the history and development of artificial intelligence?
Okay, so in terms of the history of AI, in one sense, the history of AI begins thousands of years ago because people have almost always thought about building things like themselves, idealized versions of themselves or improved versions of themselves or friends, things that won't treat you like other people will, things like that. Yeah. And that goes back to at least the ancient Greeks, probably earlier than that, but the ancient Greeks were the first to write many things down. That was what a lot of that was. So in that sense, it goes back to prehistory, essentially. Yeah. In another sense, we only started to begin getting mechanically the idea of creating something like a person in the early industrial age or the late medieval age. Mm-hmm. And we only started getting into the idea of doing any computation at all until the 19th century, and electronic computation, that was the precursors of what we would call a modern computer, in the 20th century. In the more modern sense, AI started in the early 1950s, when a bunch of mathematicians got together and had the first conference where they started to talk about the ideas that they had that would ultimately form the field that we use today. And everything in modern AI descends from that.
So it has a long history. So what makes the AI different from generative AI? What's the specialty about the generative AI?
Generative AI is just one flavor of AI or one category of AI. It's like saying, how is natural language understanding different from machine learning, different from all sorts of other things? They're different components of a bigger picture. Okay. So the generative AI is using all of the basic tools that AI in general has provided. It's just using it for a certain purpose, which is to generate responses to from people's prompts.
When we are using ChatGPT, for example, and we ask a question, immediately something is answering our questions and generates something. What is that someone or something?
That something is a piece of generative AI that resides on a server, probably in the corporate environment of OpenAI, which is the company that generates ChatGPT. ChatGPT is an application end to GPT, in this case GPT 3.5 now, that is the actual generative AI program that is receiving the prompt and then generating a response from it. How reliable is the information that's provided by these chatbots? In many cases, it's not reliable at all. It's not trained to be an authority. It's trained to generate plausible responses and act like a human. So the intent is more, would you consider this to be a person that you'd want to talk to? not is it giving you the best advice on nuclear physics that you could possibly get, because you can use Google for that.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
If you want it to act like a person, it's something different than just, at least currently, something different than just a Google search. Even though certainly kicking up search engines is one of the main application ends of generative AI, is trying to do things in a more human-like way, and therefore give you answers that are more plausible, or answers that are better matched to the corporate environment that they're trying to give you.
How do you see the future of artificial intelligence?
The future ties into the future of us as people, because we decide what we're going to use this for and how we're going to use it, and how we're allowed and not allowed to use things too. So there are ultimately going to have to be restrictions put in place on how you use this or what you're allowed to use it for. When people ask me whether I'm worried about AI, my answer is that I'm never worried about AI. I'm worried about people, because people use tools often in negative ways. And there has never been a tool that we have not used in a negative way.
Yeah, I agree.
I mean, Einstein can say that he did his nuclear physics work to send people to outer space, but it was also used for bombs.
Yeah, exactly.
And actually used for bombs, not just theoretically.
Yeah, that's true.
And we've lived with that for longer than we've lived with AI. So there's things like that. I worry more about people than about AI.
So one of the strengths of these chatbots, I think that's the ability to do coding. So how do you see the future of coding and programming using chatbots?
I don't think that's a different question from how do you see the future of using generative AI for any other purpose.
Okay.
There's the issue that it is providing you with a tool that can do some very powerful things for you. There's the idea that that tool may not be perfect, and in fact, in many cases isn't perfect, or even close to it. And there's the idea that you can use it for good or for bad.
Yeah, that's true.
Now, that means that a student that's in an undergraduate program can go to a generative AI interface and say, hey, can you write me a piece of code that will do this? And in fact, just cut and paste their assignment question in. And that's no different than somebody saying you could cut and paste a thing saying, how are you going to deal with the themes of jealousy in Shakespeare or any other subject? In fact, you're trying to pass off work being done by someone or something else as your own work.
I've seen some professors that they say it's negatively affecting the learning process of students when they are supposed to write an essay or doing an assignments. They easily just ask the chatbots. So are you worried about these aspects?
I'm worried about misuse of things in all sorts of ways. I'm worried about the deep fakes that they can generate that influence things politically and economically. I'm worried about people cheating because that's their own ethics that are suffering too. I'm concerned about what it's going to be able to do in the future that's much worse than what can be done now. Because these things can also, what's one of the things that's been new in GPT-3 over the previous ones, is they have the beginnings of what's called ideation. The idea of being able to leap from one idea to a new one. And that new one was unprompted. And the new one may be something very interesting, in the same way that a creative cook might think of a new spice and add it and improve a dish.
Yeah.
Or it may be something incredibly negative, like I need to fight this person, or do something to limit them, or something like that.
Yeah.
And that kind of power is something that we have reserved for ourselves for the most part. And we, in some cases, can barely contain our own abilities to do that, because no matter what system you set up, people will try to misuse it for their own ends. That's part of the problem with certainly anything that's open on the internet.
Yes, that's true.
People will always misuse it.
You are a faculty member at the Faculty of Law. So how is your research related to artificial intelligence?
So I work on a number of issues in terms of how artificial intelligence and more specifically machine learning, is being integrated into the judicial system.
Mhm.
And so you see different applications being used to perhaps speed up decision-making processes in terms of having different kinds of automated decision makers.
Mhm.
You see this being used in terms of having statistical or actuarial methods that are deployed to increase efficiencies, accuracies, veracity, things like that. And so we already have a broad deployment of these kinds of tools
Mhm.
within the justice system, even here in Canada. For example, immigration and refugee board decisions some of them are now automated and would never be touched by a human,
Mhm.
provided they were a positive decision. There's various places within the administrative state where decisions that affect people's livelihoods are done by an automated process. And then there's always a lot of discussion around applications of these kinds of tools for the criminal justice system as well. And so there are tools like Compass, which is broadly used in the United States
Mhm.
for calculating whether or not someone is likely to reoffend if they were released on bail in advance of their hearing. And these sorts of softwares are not supposed to be used for sentencing, but we know that they often are. They're not used in Canada just yet, but there are always other tools in the works and things coming down the pipeline that people are interested in talking about the impacts on the justice system.
Why do you think that AI and machine learning could potentially endanger the rule of law?
So what I talk about in my research is a conversion of the rule of law,
Mhm.
which is this construct that we have in our society about making sure that decision-making processes are only forward-looking, never backward-looking,
Yeah.
right? They're prospective, not retroactive. They're non-arbitrary. They're supposed to treat everybody equally under the law. And those are sort of really core tenets of what the rule of law is supposed to do in a democratic society. And what these types of technologies risk is a conversion of a rule of law into a rule by law, which is what you would tend to associate not with a democratic society, but with an authoritarian society.
Yeah.
One where decisions are made and people don't have the opportunity to contest the decision that is being made about them, where people don't have the opportunity to bring a defense or have a fair hearing or a fair trial, right? Kind of Kafka-esque consequences that you might see. And another really important problem is that a lot of these technologies are developed by companies that are private companies that have their own private corporate interests.
Yeah.
And so are the technologies being developed at their heart, at their core, do they have public values in mind, or do they have profit-driven motives given the company that is creating them?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Mhm.
How students at the Faculty of Law can benefit from these new tools like chatbots, like ChatGPT, how they can use it safely for their education?
So I'm not a big proponent of using ChatGPT in the classroom. I think that one of the things that ChatGPT does is it presents us with a script that becomes a little bit too easy to follow. And so I think some people are enthusiastic about the use of ChatGPT for things like writing first drafts, putting together summaries, putting together lists of points that are important or salient. And my fear is that people who are not well versed in the material will not know to look outside of what the generative bot has suggested. And so I've talked with my students about ChatGPT a lot because it's a big part of my research area, and I love to know what the students are thinking. And the latest is that ChatGPT is really good at coming up with good synonyms that you might have not thought of yourself. If you have a few ingredients left in the fridge, ChatGPT can suggest a recipe to use them up. And if you are having trouble falling asleep, it can make up a funny or silly story about you and your friends that is quite compelling. But reports from my students is when they try to upload their notes to it or ask it to produce any kind of synthesis or information like that, the results are not very good.
So, does ChatGPT respect the confidentiality of the prompt and the response and the information that we punch in?
Absolutely not. Yeah. So one thing that you have to remember anytime that you're interacting with these kinds of companies is that their privacy policies are subject to change. And so you as a user, by virtue of entering into an agreement, right? So in contract law, they would call these end user licensing agreements or click wrap contracts. And this is the experience that a lot of us have anytime we're asked to click I agree in order to use any of the softwares we encounter online. Or sometimes the terms of service are even vaguer, right? The mere act of using the technology you are presumed to have agreed. And so you don't have a lot of bargaining power with the company in terms of what are the rules that are being set out. Can you negotiate about whether your privacy is going to be protected? And even if you go through the whole privacy policy, make sure that you're comfortable with everything that ChatGPT is doing with your data. It's subject to change. They can turn around and release a new privacy policy anytime that they want. And so one of the things that's very clear from the way that they operate is that any inputs that people give to ChatGPT can be used as part of their training data for refining and making the algorithm better. And so if people are putting sensitive or confidential information in there, right, if lawyers are using that and lawyers are putting information in that would violate the solicitor-client relationship, I mean, that's something to be aware of and to be worried about because it's not going to have a good outcome.
Yeah. So is there any regulations or restrictions imposed to these companies by the government, let's say here in Canada? Is there anything?
So not yet. These are the sorts of things that are being debated in the context of Bill C-27, which is a number of acts, the Digital Charter Implementation Act, that is supposed to update a couple of pieces of Canadian legislation. So privacy legislation in Canada right now is PIPEDA, the Protection of Information, Protection of Electronic Documents Act, right? But that's been in place since 2001, and so PIPEDA is quite outdated, and they are trying to change it, but there are a number of sort of debates about the best way to do that. They've also proposed what's called the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act, AIDA, but it was brought to the floor of the House of Commons before generative AI came out, so it doesn't include provisions that specifically speak to generative AI, at least not at this stage. They might be introduced through amendment or through the committee process, but it's not yet clear.
So it's a rapidly evolving situation that the law system cannot keep up with it, right?
Well, this is always the problem when you study technology and the law, is that the very common refrain is you'll hear this thing. It's called the pacing problem or the Collingridge dilemma. This idea that law is always out of step with technology because technology moves so fast, and law requires that sober second thought or that long regulatory process that's going to take 5 to 10 years of careful examination in order to come up with a bill to regulate it, and by then Silicon Valley's moved on to something else, right? Exactly. But I mean, I think there is a space within that framework for thinking through models that are sufficiently flexible that they don't need to be amended every single time you come up with a new piece of technology.
To which degree you think that AI can replace with a lawyer?
Well, I don't think AI is ever going to replace humans entirely, but I do think if the capabilities of the technology continue to grow, you might see more AI as part of a team, kind of a co-robotics concept, where you would have humans and AI systems that are working together at things that they are each respectively good at. And so AIs can be really good at going through massive amounts of information, parsing that information, producing outputs, right, refining those outputs. But they're not good at visioning beyond what comes through their data set and coming up with a future that is different from the past that exists within the data that they have been trained on, right? So they don't have that sort of memory of living in a collective world like humans do. And so they don't have the capability to make sudden changes to the things that they've learned and to vision what kind of future we want to create.
One of your research interests is the interaction between human and AI. Would you tell us more about it?
Yeah, so I'm really interested in the way in which people form different kinds of connections and relationships with AI. So people use it obviously as a tool,
Yeah.
but I'm more interested in the way people use it when they're not being goal directed. So whether it's as someone to help them as a therapist, whether it's just someone to chat with, just to have a friendship with, have a relationship with, maybe people using it for religious guidance. I think that's a big one. I think most major religions now you can find a chatbot. I think all of them actually. You can find a chatbot that will speak to you in, just give you specific guidance for that religion, or with Jesus, it will say, well, you can say to these chatbots, speak to me as Jesus would. It just uses the text from the Bible. So I think there's lots of ways that people are actually forming real connections with chatbots, and I think that's kind of exciting.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's a new era, and it's a topic that's evolving. I didn't know that people use it for these purposes. It's quite interesting for me. What's your concern about using chatbots?
So I have different kinds of concerns, I guess. So let me say, first of all, I'm actually pretty positive about chatbots. I think that right now they're proving to be really interesting, and I think it's really exciting, some of the things people are doing. I do have concerns. So first of all, I have a lot of concerns about the kind of data that's being collected and the kinds of privacy protections that I think just don't exist right now. So I think that, especially when you're talking about these kinds of close connections people are forming, where they may be saying really intimate things, where they may be opening up about their lives, I think that we need to be very cautious about, we need to be very sure we're protecting people's privacy. One of the big things actually is that a lot of these companies, if you form a relationship, you form a connection with a chatbot, the company may change the terms of service. So that happened with a chatbot called Replica, where people were forming intimate connections with it. And then the company one day just changed all the functionality of the chatbot. And so people were quite upset. And I think also a company could go out of business and your chatbot could just die because the company's gone out of business. Probably won't happen with, OpenAI or Microsoft or Google or something like that. But with other kinds of more specialized chatbots, that could easily happen. So I worry a lot about that, about the terms of service changing or the company going out of business. And then I think I do worry that people may misunderstand what these chatbots are and the power they have. So one of the things I've thought about is whether people may start to see them as religious leaders and may start to build religions around them. I think that's really worrisome. I think that these chatbots could be used also to manipulate us. I mean, if people are forming connections with them, that could be used to sell as products or to promote certain kinds of views, certain kinds of ideals. And then I also worry about just making sure that the chatbots have views that reflect our own views as society, and they don't have, racist views or something like that.
Yeah. That's the thing that users should be concerned about also and take into consideration. Yeah. How artificial intelligence can be used in research in philosophy?
So I think I think first of all, you can use it to find out more facts about different philosophers. Now, right now, it's very unreliable. I've tried entering in different famous philosophers, and it will make up papers that they've supposedly written that they haven't actually written. So there's you can't really trust it right now. I do think that will get better. It will stop producing false information as much. And so I think it'll be a very good resource for people to understand. I mean, a lot of philosophy ideas are very complicated.
Yeah.
And reading the text can be very complicated. And having a chatbot summarize it for you and present it to you in a clear way, I think could be very helpful for students in dealing with really difficult texts.
Yeah.
I think that when students are trying to write philosophy, I hope they don't use ChatGPT just to write their essays. But I do think that the chatbots can help prompt them or help review their essays. You can put your essay in and have it give you comments, and so I think that could be really useful.
So, what's your suggestions for students, those who want to use these chatbots, OpenAI for their research safely? What do you recommend?
So I think first of all, be very careful about the information it gives you. Always check your sources. I think there are chatbots now that when they give you information, they'll link to sources. So I think those are useful because I think you have to check everything. You want to be safe with it. And then I think you don't want it to do your work for you. I think you want to use it as an editor, as a sort of friend to talk to about different ideas, someone to bounce ideas off of, summarize different texts and so on. I think all that can be very useful and helpful. And so I think there's lots of ways to do it safely. I think, yeah, just don't rely on it to write your whole essay. That would be my opinion.
Yeah, exactly. Can AI and AI controlled machines take over our lives, just like what we see in the science fiction movies?
So we don't know that for now, but I think that a lot of people take that risk very seriously. And there's a lot of philosophers and a lot of researchers who think that's a very real danger. And so it seems sort of outlandish. It seems like science fiction, but it only seems like that till it happens. And so I think it's probably not likely that it's going to happen, but it's a real risk. And so when you've got something that is even a small chance of happening, but where the consequences would be extremely dire, then I think it makes sense to protect against that risk. And so I think that the best thing we can do is take it seriously and try to build in guardrails, whether it's the companies or government. I think everyone has to work together. I think that AI safety has to be talked about and taken seriously. I think it should be a priority. And I think that governments really have to get involved and make sure that this doesn't happen.
Can generative AI be used in the University of Manitoba?
I think there is a place for it, but we're just not quite sure how yet. So it means that people need to be open to experimenting with this, but also understanding the ethical implications of a decision to use it in the work of the university, whether that be teaching and learning, research, or our other tasks that we do in teaching and work and in learning.
Yeah, so officially it's not banned by the university.
No, it's not banned by the university. What we encourage people to do, educators to do, is look at their courses, really understand what their learning outcomes for their courses are, and select activities, learning activities, and assessments that align with those learning objectives. If generative AI is part of that, then one might want to explore how it could be used to support learning.
Okay, so it takes me to the next question, that how students can use it for their assignments, courses. So what's your suggestion, how they should take advantage of this technology?
I think where this technology is very useful for students, of course with the permission of instructors, is as a brainstorming tool. So, asking some questions, trying to figure out where exactly one wants to go with different ideas in assignments, but keeping in mind that what is produced by this kind of technology needs to be thought through. It needs to be examined carefully, and critical thinking is part of that.
Exactly, yeah. How professors and instructors can understand that an assignment, an essay, or something like that has been generated by AI?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the tendency or the temptation is to use another technology to detect use of technology. What we do know from researchers who study this is that AI detectors are not very accurate or reliable, and there's a lot of factors that play into detection. So one of the ways that I would suggest as an educator is to understand your students' work. So this means paying attention to the pattern of learning that's happening throughout a course, and then look for indicators within the submissions that have been submitted for grades and for assessment. That does take a lot of effort and time, but it's really crucial. And some of these same indicators of Gen AI would be the same indicators that we've educated people about for contract cheating.
If a student used Gen AI, let's say for improving the language, so how they can cite it?
So the general understanding is that a generative AI tool shouldn't be cited. It's not an author of something, it's just responding. So the general approach to this is to acknowledge that a tool like this has been used.
Okay.
So an instructor might have a specific way that they want students to share that information. Some of the recommendations are to approach this like in APA formatting, is to have it in the acknowledgments section.
Yeah.
And I've also used Gen AI to help me with presentations. And so what I've done is I've put a statement right on the slide that has the content that has that was generated by Gen AI.
Excellent, excellent. I've used it for improving the language, and so now I know how I can acknowledge it.
Yes.
You have attended several conferences regarding this topic, which is an evolving topic. So what's the concern of people in the community, in the academic community, about Gen AI?
Yeah, so my research area and my practice area in my position has been the promotion of academic integrity. And part of that is the concern that goes with it is academic misconduct.
Yeah.
And that really can call into question the validity of any sort of assessment. And I think that is one of the key areas that people are concerned about. You know, if they're generating an assessment that is supposed to be a measure of students' learning, if students are bypassing the learning and submitting something that was produced by someone else or by a tool, then how valid is the assessment tool? And so we talk a lot about that. And for a long time, the academic integrity research community and the practice community has encouraged the promotion of academic integrity and working with students to build relationships and have trust and convince students, and many students do not need convincing, that it is important to be engaged in learning and in the learning process. And making mistakes is part of the learning process. Asking for help is also part of the learning process.
How can students use it constructively for their program and education?
So there's so many different tools that it's very difficult for me to say this is the tool that you would use for this kind of activity and so on and so forth. But if we just think about the tools that are much more easily accessible, like the chat tools, students can use those in a way to obtain feedback on their writing if they're comfortable with it. If you put information in, you also lose kind of control of your information. So there's an ethical consideration to think about. But it could be used as a feedback tool. It could be used, like I mentioned earlier, a brainstorming tool. And I think when the intention of the student is to go in to use some of these tools, that it is for learning and learning purposes and trying to get over and solve a problem, that is a constructive way to use the tool. However, having said that, it's really important that students understand the expectations of their instructor. So if an instructor says, you are not to use a tool like this in any of your assignments, that's very important information. And there are good reasons to not use these kinds of tools.
Yeah, you shared a post about your experience with ChatGPT.
That's right,
on LinkedIn. Could you tell us more about it?
So with ChatGPT increasing in popularity, I was getting concerned about the use of ChatGPT by students on assignments. And so I was getting worried that our assignments, homework is not as effective anymore. And so I had tried some things before with ChatGPT with some of my homework. And sometimes it's really good. Typically, I find, if I was to grade the ChatGPT answer, I would typically, get about 70% or something like this, maybe 80%, right? But this was a particular one where I was thinking, calculation. It was a calculation question. I was wondering how much can ChatGPT help with that, because it's generative text, right? It doesn't really handle calculations as calculations, right? It handles them as text. And so it started out by giving a wonderful description of how to solve the problem.
But when I pushed it to ask to respond in terms of numbers, it made mistakes, and I pointed out the mistake, and ChatGPT agreed with me. There's a mistake, and then it went through the whole cake. Let me try this again. It said, right, ChatGPT, let me try this again. You're right. There's a mistake, and it came to the same answer. And I said, oh, I made the mistake again. I have to try again. And I came again to the wrong answer. And that's where I gave up. And so that was very funny to me, because it was, in a way, very similar to how students would respond to a question, right? And but it was very funny how human that response was in making a mistake and making it again and not really figuring out where the problem is, right? And eventually, by explaining the mistake, it actually did get to the right answer in the end, right? But it was interesting. It was interesting to see. It was also interesting to see, actually, that it could handle numbers in an approximate way. So not exact, but approximately it could understand simple calculations.
Do you mind if your students use ChatGPT for their course?
No, I think it's not really something I can control. It's not something I can prevent. I give students disclaimers. If you use ChatGPT, make sure that, first of all, you understand what the output is, right? And secondly, to look at it critically, right? Because ChatGPT does make mistakes.
With that being said, are you concerned about the quality of education and learning process for students, for the new generation?
I think no. I think there are ways to make assessments that are not easily fooled. So in terms of our education, we do need to absolutely adjust, right? But I think it's just a matter of adjustment, right? It's not. I don't think I'm worried about that. I'm worried if we are just ignoring the fact that this is so easily accessible, that information, right? And if we're just saying, well, AI is available now, so students don't need to learn things anymore, right? Kind of thing, right? Because at the end of the day, as easily as that information is available, you cannot operate having to look everything up, right? But I mean, that's actually not a new problem, though, right? I mean, the internet has changed that as well, right? Has made everything available at our fingertips, right? Even honestly, to some extent, the printing press, right?
Yes.
So I mean, we've gone through iterations of that already, right? And I think it's a very similar challenge that we have with AI, but I think it's something that can be addressed. But the key point, though, is that students still need to learn things, right? And AI still needs to be trained, right? And so on, right? We cannot just solely rely on artificial intelligence to do these jobs for us.
How do you see the future of the research that you are interested in actually using AI and machine learning?
So there is some really interesting aspects of that research. I don't know whether in glass research it's the same thing, but I know that there is a integration of AI in some research labs now with automated synthesis and testing and characterization labs, essentially, right? So my research is in battery materials, right? And so there's a few labs now where a robotic system has been set up that can synthesize new lithium-ion battery materials in a number of different combinations, take diffractograms of the produced materials, and then prepare an electrochemical testing cell and do some electrochemical testing on those. And then the idea is that this information is being fed back into an artificial intelligence that incrementally optimizes the synthesis and combinations of elements that are being used there. And so I think there's a few clever ways in which artificial intelligence could really just speed up processes, right? Yeah. Making things faster. I think that is really the main advantage.